Throughout your years in middle school and high school, a Canadian student will learn countless information about history. World history including both world wars, various revolutions, and all the important milestones that have made our world what it is today. We will also learn about Canadian history, but the Canadian history we may learn about in various public and private rural and urban schools may differ in what is taught. One thing that is quite common in schools though is the absence of required currents and unit that focuses on Indigenous rights and overall a lack of education on white privilege. Are we really giving high school students the best education if we often barely cover a current part of our history? The historical and current racism that exists, especially when looking at the treatment of Indigenous people in our country. I grew up in a small Saskatchewan town and went to a rural high school, Covington High School. This school was quite small. My graduating class had 23 students, and this was viewed as a big class from the school. Being so small, it isn't surprising that the school was not very diverse. The students and teachers were predominantly Caucasian. Perhaps this played a role in the education I received, surrounding Canadian history and world history. From my recollection, this education was focused on a more whitewashed history, compared to the full history I now know. From middle school social studies to high school history classes, we rarely covered Indigenous history or Indigenous studies. Although we learned about colonization and settler and Indigenous relations, I now realize it was taught fully from a settler's viewpoint. We hardly learned about residential schools and the 60 scoop other than learning what they were and the justification behind them. The only Indigenous leaders we really learned about were Louis Riel and other leaders in the Métis rebellions, and even that was just briefly units. I certainly have never had a teacher acknowledge that the Canadian government actively tried to commit a cultural genocide on Indigenous people. More, we were taught that the settlers and colonization was our way of trying to help Indigenous people thrive in a Eurocentric society. It wasn't until I moved to Regina to attend the University of Regina back in 2015, which was a bit of a cultural shock to me, as I was introduced to a much more diverse community. This is where I started to learn more about Canadian history and how there was more to it, especially in regards to Indigenous people and their culture. At university, I was able to take classes that looked at various aspects of Canadian history from an Indigenous viewpoint, which gave me more of the true history and everything that Indigenous people have gone through and continue to go through in our own country. I learned how colonization was less about building settler and Indigenous relations. Although it may have started that way, it quickly turned into being a tool used to assimilate Indigenous people into European culture and ultimately as a cultural genocide on Indigenous culture. From residential schools to the 60 scoop and continuing the same ideologies today that center around removing Indigenous children from their home and communities and putting them with non-Indigenous families and into institutions designed to kill the Indian and the child, like residential schools. It's been during my university education I have truly realized the immense amount of systematic racism that Canada has when it comes to Indigenous people. Now this is common knowledge and more people are aware and open to learning about this racism and oppression. But perhaps in the spirit of repairing our relationships with Indigenous people, there needs to be some clear education in our high schools that focuses on educating all Canadians about the systematic racism, historical and current, in our own country. The trauma we historically cause Indigenous people, the presence of white privilege and what that means, and ultimately how to be anti-racist. Now, to graduate from high school in Saskatchewan and receive your grade 12 diploma, it requires a combination of required courses mixed in with some electives. The current course Requirements to graduate include English, math, science, and history. And then you need a number of electives, including some specific ones throughout the years. Physical education and wellness, practical arts, so on and so on, unless you're in the bilingual and French school. Then you also need French language classes, and you take so many of your classes in French. So every Saskatchewan child will learn history if they graduate grade 12, but the question becomes what is taught in history high school. For the most part, our education into history starts in grade 5 and 6 as social studies. It starts to teach students about Canada and the world. You don't start taking actual history classes until grade 10, 11, and 12, which often history 10, 20, and 30 respectively. When I first started this presentation, I asked my one friend, who teaches history 10, what history is taught in high schools nowadays. Just wanted to see if no one's new units and to refresh my memory on what I was taught in high school in case I forgot something. She described the 3 different history classes outlined for me. History 10 focuses on feudalism, monarchies, the French, and industrial revolutions. Not much on Canada's history, more European history, but still relevant knowledge you learn. History 20 switches to more world history. Both the World Wars 1 and 2, the Cold War, and totalitarianism, focusing on Hitler and Stalin. Again, not much about Canadian history, but still quite important knowledge you learn, as those who don't learn history are doomed to repeat it. History 30, though, this class is fully focused on Canadian history, which is supposed to cover first contact, discovery and exploration of Canada, Confederation, Canada's involvement in World War I, the Great Depression, Canada's involvement in World War II, the history of democracy, important prime ministers and First Nation leaders. My friend told me that due to this curriculum from History 30 being so massive, a teacher rarely gets all the way through it and will pick and choose what topics they cover, which perhaps can be solved in the teacher choosing to forego teaching about Indigenous leaders and only briefly covering first contact and focusing on the Great Depression and democracy and prime ministers. Also, if History 20 is supposed to focus on both the world wars, why not cover Canada's involvement in the Great Wars in History 20 and not History 30 to make more time to look at Canadian history? All that being said though, in 1997, a Native Studies curriculum was created and schools offer students the choice to take Native Studies, if they choose to in place of history class and as a social science elective. My high school never offered that class, which I find funny because the curriculum guide clearly states the aim of Native Studies is to develop personal awareness and cultural understanding and to promote the development of positive attitudes in all students towards Indigenous people. If the aim of this class is to reach all students, wouldn't it be more beneficial to make it a required class, or even a required unit in a history class, as opposed to being a class you couldn't take if it's offered in your school? This does tie into the 2007 decision to incorporate mandatory treaty education in schools, which created a bit of conflict that makes me believe it is still a fight to truly offer Native Studies in high school, as there were several teachers and people who didn't want mandatory treaty education, because they viewed it as unimportant, not Canadian history, not relevant, or they didn't know enough on the topic to teach it. Perhaps that is partly why my school and the entire school division Covenant High School was a part of didn't offer Native Studies in the schools. Perhaps they just couldn't find a teacher who can teach it. Perhaps there wasn't enough students willing to take it. Or perhaps people weren't and still aren't comfortable teaching history that isn't the whitewashed history we learn as kids. There is no debate that it is vitally important to learn about Indigenous culture and the history of Indigenous people in Canada, as it is a current part of our history. By the creation of mandatory treaty education, and creating Native Studies courses as a social science elective class in high schools, we see some change. And now, even though these have been steps towards introducing the opportunity for all students to learn about Indigenous culture and the history, there are some drawbacks. The largest one being the fact that Native Studies may not be offered in all Saskatchewan schools, especially in small and rural schools that have a small number of students and a small number of staff that may be willing to teach or take these classes. They may not have an interest and be willing to take Native Studies or have someone willing to teach it. A lot of teachers are usually already overworked in teaching multiple classes in rural communities. They may not have the time or energy to often to teach another elective class. More so, they may not feel like they can teach Native Studies due to not knowing enough about the topic, which can result in the schools that offer Native Studies and have a teacher to teach it. The teacher may not be accredited or have an Indigenous Studies background, which can raise questions on the quality of education received in these classes. It is also a concern as if a teacher believes themselves to be unqualified to teach Native Studies. They can go out and learn about it and build the capacity to teach Native Studies. But what if a teacher doesn't have the time to take on the additional learning and workload to make themselves feel qualified in teaching Native Studies? And what if they don't feel they need to? I know I have yet to meet anyone who teaches Native Studies. I have met very limited people who took Native Studies in high school, and even had a choice of taking Native Studies in high school. By creating a high school curriculum that has a required unit or class that focuses on Indigenous studies, it can result in a win-win situation in our high school education. Not only can it look at giving the youth of our society a chance to learn everything about Canada, even the dark stuff that we don't like to talk about, it can result in our education system working with Indigenous communities to help either educate our teachers on Indigenous culture and history, or having Indigenous leaders and educators working with schools to help teach and offer Native Studies, perhaps with a guest teacher for a unit, and coming and teaching for a semester, to allow some students to take Indigenous Studies and have it taught in a proper beneficial way that allows students to learn the information. Not only can this be greatly beneficial to our education system, it can also help us educate high schoolers about white privilege and how to start thinking like an anti-racist. Since education is one of the first steps needed for change, perhaps this education can drive the change in our province to eliminate some of the systematic racism we have. White privilege, being placed higher in society based solely on someone's race and skin color, is a very real thing and is seen every day in society. It's something that isn't talked about a lot. People don't often like to acknowledge that their race may automatically give them a leg up in society, but sadly, that is the case. By introducing more Indigenous studies in high school, it can also openly done in allowing for conversations about white privilege, race, and racism. These conversations often get silenced as the dominant groups in society don't like to talk about things that are uncomfortable for them, and especially don't like to acknowledge that they have privilege solely based on their race. I believe the first time I ever heard the phrase white privilege was probably my second or third year of university, which was quite eye-opening to me as it made me reflect back and realize how true it was. I am white, and I can say I do have white privilege in a number of everyday activities and interactions. Not being followed when I go into a store, not being pulled over due to my skin color, and many, many more. Perhaps if we expose high schoolers to the idea of white privilege earlier, we can help educate our youth on the racism in our society and help spark change. As my professor has consistently told me, it's not enough to be not a racist, you have to be anti-racist. But how can people be anti-racist if the racism in our province and country doesn't get talked about until they go to post-secondary school and take the classes that talk about it? Reevaluating our high school education to include more of Indigenous culture and history can open the eyes of our students to the presence of racism in our society and thus openly different conversation about how to be anti-racist. The first step in becoming anti-racist is to acknowledge there is racism in society and to learn about the racism that is in Canada and Saskatchewan. Teaching Indigenous studies can show students that there has always and continues to be racist practices and ideas in our country, which in turn can allow for these students to engage in a conversation about race, racism, discrimination, white privilege, and how to be anti-racist. As I've mentioned, there has been changes in our education system. To learn about Indigenous culture and history, treaty education, and Native studies, which, in bigger schools, such as schools in cities and private learning schools, have made strides in incorporating more Indigenous studies in their education. These schools will have others come out and speak to the students and to give them teachings. But when it comes to our rural schools, this is work that needs to be done. When talking with people back in my hometown, it does sound like today the students do learn much more about Indigenous culture and history than I did. But in comparison to schools in the city, it is on a vastly smaller scale. I know several Regina schools that will have Indigenous elders and leaders come in to give lectures and to teach students about Indigenous culture. And Regina schools have access to the staff to properly teach Indigenous studies to the students. Our rural schools often don't have that opportunity. Therefore, making it mandatory unit at least can be beneficial as it forces teachers to focus on Indigenous studies and allows for every student the opportunity to learn about the true Canadian history and Indigenous culture and history. Now, this will not be easy to do, as it is not enough to make it mandatory to learn Indigenous studies. It has to be taught in the best way possible to ensure the highest quality of education possible. And although there have been steps towards more Indigenous studies education in our schools, it is not enough until we allow every student a chance to learn about Indigenous culture and the dark side of Canadian history. Because only when we are providing this education can we truly start to fight more for change in our province and country that creates a society that does not push people down due to their race, culture, and identity. By implementing mandatory Indigenous studies in schools, we can provide this education to all students, whether they be in a school of 100 people or a school of 1,000 people. It's something that must be done. Thank you for listening.